with a new stream key. Let's have a look. We will have a look again and see what's going on here. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm hoping that we're going to be live in just a minute. Let's try from a different browser, see if that makes a difference. Because these things are sometimes sent to try us. Right. Bang. Right, let's see. Are we live? Are we live? I think we might actually be live. Hey, I think we're live. We're looking. Yes, we're live. Sorry about that, everyone. Sorry about anyone who. Oh, was that the previous live? Sorry about anyone who missed that. Not sure what's going on there. Right. We should be live again. Right. Do we have a. Yes, we have a live feed. I'm just going to wave my hands to check that it's actually showing the right thing. It's. Let's just see. Good. We do have a live feed. It's slightly deleted. It's slightly delayed, sorry. Yes, we have a live feed. Sorry, anyone who had to wait on that. I'm going to see if anyone's still in the chat. Don't know what I did to the chat comments. Right. Good. Let's pull out the chat and we are live and we are good. And it's all good. Right. Let's just pull out some chat. Right. After some crazy technical difficulties, I hope people will still manage to join us. I've pulled the chat back out. We're all good again. Right. So after some crazy technical difficulties, we are at last here. My apologies if there is a slight delay. I can see on my monitor there's a very slight delay. Sometimes these things cannot be avoided. The main thing is we have sound, we have broadcast, and it's all good. Now, this is an interview I have been looking forward to from as soon as we set it up. One of the things that people don't realise is that interpreters, as well as being language experts, are also people in the events sector. We've already had a comment from someone talking about how frustrating it can be, people not realising that we're in the sector as well. And so it gives me great pleasure. It gives me great pleasure to watch the technology annoy me, but there we go. Give me 1 second. Gives me great pleasure to have Rob Davidson from Mice Knowledge here on the show. He is, let me get your bio up, Rob, because my phone decided to not have your bio. Right, here we go. Sorry, this has been one of those lives where everything goes crazy wrong. Right, so Rob is Managing Director of Mice Knowledge, a consultancy specialising in research, education and training services for the meetings and events industry. His main areas of expertise are conferences and incentive travel, and he's written 7 books on those themes. Can I just say, as someone who's written 2 books, 7 is just beyond my imagination. I can't even imagine what it must have been like to write 7. Now, I'm just saying hi in the chat. I love to get people to say hi, tell us where they're from, come and say hello. But Rob, before you get into your talk, I just want to ask you, 7 books. That's impressive. Can you remember the titles of all 7 of them?
I think they all have conferences or events or meetings in the title, but I have to say, Jonathan, every time I write a book, I tell myself and I tell the world that's the last book I'm ever going to write. And then, of course, you have an idea for another one, and you say, oh, one more, one more, one more. You'll see, you'll get to 7 before you know it.
I'm only on 2, and the last one I wrote, I remember writing the final chapter going, with all the research I've done on that, I'm not sure that I could do the research for another book.
You'll see. You will.
So the normal format of this is I invite people to give a kind of very relaxed 10-ish minute talk just on a topic that they're really into. And one of the topics that we got talking to and we were chatting on a previous call was this idea of trends in the meetings industry. And I don't know if you're aware, but many interpreters are very scared of this idea that everyone might one day speak English. And, that's it, our jobs will be over. So can you kind of talk us through for the next 10 minutes or so some of the trends going on in meetings, especially when it comes to languages?
Sure, Jonathan. Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for the kind invitation to be interviewed by you today. And hello to the audience. It's a special treat for you today to have two Scotsmen in front of you, one from the east of Scotland, and I think one from the west of Scotland. So you have everything here. Um, yes, trends. It's been an interesting year for trends in the conference industry. And of course, we can't talk about trends without um, taking the pandemic into
Mm,
account. But I think what's interesting is that even before the pandemic came upon us, that our industry and really I do say our industry
mm,
because from my perspective, conference interpreters are 100% part of our industry. Um, Even before the pandemic arrived, we were already seeing some quite radical changes, some of them quite positive. Year after year, we were noticing that there were more conferences,
mm,
yeah, which is very positive. One thing that we measure quite well in the conference industry are the conferences of international associations,
mm,
and that can be anything from the European Society of Undertakers to the, the Global Society of Airline Pilots.
mm,
Now, those associations, federations, clubs, uh, they meet regularly, often every year, and that's part of their internal regulations. So they are an interesting source of business for all suppliers in the conference industry, and that includes um, venues, hospitality, interpreters, of
mm,
course, everyone right down to florists and people who make conference badges. So, counting those conferences, we were seeing growth every year. But at the same time, we were seeing an interesting trend, which was that the delegate numbers or the attendee numbers were coming down.
mm,
So more conferences, but gradually every year getting smaller. And we know that one reason for that was that the professions are specializing
mm,
rapidly. And people want to go to conferences in their specialization. They want people who are specialized in their field rather than generic conferences for dentists. They'd much rather go and hear presentations about
mm,
their specialism in the field of dentistry or nursing or physics or whatever.
mm,
So more conferences, but smaller, which really doesn't concern interpreters one way or the other. I've been to many
mm, mm,
conferences where the number of interpreters has outnumbered the number of participants who need the interpretation. And normally I'm one of those participants. I go to Poland to speak at a conference, I've got three interpreters at the back of the room, and they're just working for me because everyone else in the room speaks fluent Polish language. So that was a source of growth in our industry. Also, an interesting reason for growth is that the amount of knowledge being produced by all the professions was growing rapidly
mm,
year after year. And associations were finding that just in order to keep their own level of knowledge up to date, they were having to meet more frequently. So instead of having a meeting, a conference every 2 years, they were meeting every year. And that was another very powerful trend. Again, creating business for the conference industry. We were seeing a wider geographical spread. So
mm,
the places where conferences were being held were spread basically across the planet, and
mm,
destinations uh, in the Middle East, for example, the Far East, South America. were opening their doors and building conference centers to welcome international conferences. So we saw that in terms of supply, but also in terms of demand. We were seeing more nationalities attending international conferences. For example, everyone knows China. The Chinese now have the, the means to travel internationally. They have the freedom to travel to most countries internationally, and that was adding to the all important attendee numbers. Of course, we can't look at trends without looking at technology,
Mm.
and we'll come back to that when we look at future trends. But even before the pandemic, we were seeing hybrid events growing very fast, where the number of people following the meeting online usually outnumbered the people sitting live in the room where the conference was taking place. Many associations embraced hybrid events very quickly, recording the content of their meetings and making that available either free or for sale after the face-to-face event. But I think that for the interpreter's point of view, one of the more interesting trends and challenging trends for your profession was the changing formats of conferences. In other words, moving away from the a classic format of speakers on the stage speaking for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then being replaced by another speaker. We saw a great pressure on speakers to speak for less time, shorter presentations, more bite-sized presentations, if you like, um, and different formats, including, for example, television chat show formats, where instead of having one speaker on the stage, you have two or three being interviewed by a moderator, by a presenter, a much more relaxed and modern feeling format than simply speaker after speaker after speaker. Now, you can see already that from the point of view of interpreters, having multiple speakers, having a dialogue on stage is quite different to having single, what we used to call sage on the stage presentations, where the wise man or wise woman would impart their knowledge and then be replaced by another speaker just after that. Also, more flexibility in terms of the format, with more participation from the people sitting in the audience, the attendees themselves. Much more involvement with them, more what I call off-program meetings, fireside meetings where you get groups of attendees meeting more or less informally outside the main conference room. Those sessions can be very valuable to the participants. That's their opportunity to share knowledge, experience with each other. Now, again, how do interpreters add value to those situations? Also, I think one realization that was coming home pre-pandemic was that a lot of the value of attending conferences are those informal uh, serendipity moments which happen over coffee, in the lunch break, in the evening, where in the bar, where you're meeting other participants and chatting to them. That's a lot of the value of attending conferences. Now, again, something to reflect upon for interpreters is how are you present in those situations which are, less formal, but if you've got two people from who don't have a mutually understandable language, they need your help. So already the format was changing very dramatically. Now, of course, everyone knows with the pandemic, um, there have been radical changes, and maybe this is an example of it, our online interview. But we can already see that after the pandemic, and everyone wants to know when that will be, there will be some more trends we need to take into account. A simple one is there will be more concern for the natural environment, because if there's one winner in this whole horrible pandemic, it's the environment, less traffic, airplanes, and so on. Um, there will be less extravagance, the kind of those luxury events, champagne-driven conferences. They will be out of tone, I think, with the world when we are at the end of this pandemic. But it's no doubt we're going to see much more competition from technology. Don't forget that many organizations, many companies during the pandemic are experimenting with virtual meetings for the first time. And I have no doubt that many of those organizations, companies will continue to use virtual events. So again, for interpreters, that's the challenge. How do you contribute to those online
Mm.
events? Um, I think what it means is that we all need to think very deeply about our the value that we add to conferences, and that goes for conference organizers, for conference venues, for convention bureaus. What is our new role going to be? And for people like yourselves, conference interpreters, how do you add value? For example, a question in my mind, has been in my mind for some time, is can we demonstrate in terms of numbers that when interpreting services are offered at an international event, can we put our hands on our hearts and show that that leads to an increase in participant numbers? Because if we can, and we're going to have to, that's a very convincing argument for the people who organize conferences, a good reason for them to include interpreting services. Money will be in short supply, and the pennies will be counted by conference organizers, conference
Yep.
participants. We're going to have to show our added value. Everyone, how do we demonstrate that very clearly? Because if we can't, I'm sorry, we may not have a future.
That is, I mean, that's a great place to end because not only does it sound like a quote from the subtitle of my first book, which was being a successful interpreter, adding value and delivering excellence, which is nice. I've been talking about adding value for a while, but also I think it really gets to the heart of what we're concerned about when we talk about trends in the meetings industry. I've come across a lot of interpreters who have this idea that so long as we keep doing what we've always done, there will always be work for us. And what you seem to be saying, I was taking a note of the trends that you put that you're talking about there. If conferences are changing format, if they're changing place, if they're changing even kind of space, whether they're virtual or in person or both, then it sounds like the conference sector is going through a huge change in terms of what the added value of a conference is and what a conference should look like. Um, has there been any kind of deep discussions in the conference sector as to, why do we have a conference when we can send an email or have a website? Has the sector itself had that conversation with itself about the added value that conferences bring?
Oh yes, and this has been a discussion in the conference industry for, well, for at least 10 years. And and during those 10 years, some people have been predicting the end of the conference industry, and we're still
Yep.
here. Yes, it's it's technology that is our friend and our enemy in some senses, because I mean we've benefited hugely from technology, even from the early days of the dreaded PowerPoint. We're using technology uh, a lot to enhance conferences, to make them more productive, more efficient. Conference apps these days are something you'll find at any large conference, and those are amazing things. They can do all kinds of things, um, help you to find people in the room that are the most fruitful people for you to network with, for example. Technology has made conferences much more interesting and a much more effective use of the participants' time.
Mm.
At the same time, since the early days of video conferencing or teleconferencing, people have been saying, well, do we need to put people on trains and planes and put them up in hotel rooms when we can simply go online? Now, I think anyone who's spent a lot of time in online meetings, and that's almost all of us in the last 6 months, knows that there are disadvantages of meeting like that. And I think those disadvantages, those limitations, are something that we all need to be aware of, and we need to repeat those arguments constantly to justify the continuing use of face-to-face events. Face-to-face events are imperative when you're not simply giving out information, but trying to motivate people, to create a dialogue, to inspire people. That's very difficult to do on Zoom or on Skype or something like that. Networking, it's
Mm.
very difficult to do virtual networking. We know the arguments. We in the conference industry have been repeating these things for, as I say, at least 10 years, and we just need now more than ever to drive those arguments home.
Mm. And I think there's a lot of these arguments are very similar to the arguments that we've made about interpreting. People say you can use a machine, you can use Google Translate, and we've been making the argument now for a couple of years that actually it's not just about does the person understand what the speaker said, it's is the person as persuaded,
Mm.
excited, emotionally. I love the fact that in the meetings industry there's been an experiential meetings phase that seems to still be going, where people are going, we don't just go to our conference to get information, we go to our conference to experience something. And that seems to be a big part of the PR that the event industry's done recently, is going from talking about conferences to talking about events and experiences. Is there more to that than just a change in words for a new word that sounds better? Is there something really different going on with the dawn of experiential events?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I think that this partly an impact of Generation Y and Generation Z, who looked at the old model of conferences and said, no, we don't want that. These are young men and women who grew up in the so-called experience economy, and for them everything is an experience. They go for a coffee to Starbucks. It's an experience. It's not just here's a coffee, have a nice drink. It's the background music, it's the Wi-Fi, it's the merchandising, it's the 36 different types of coffee. It's an experience. And when they come to our events, they're expecting a high level of experience as well. They're expecting more personalization, where there's not just here's the model, take it or leave it. They're expecting that kind of personalization. Festivalization is something else which we are increasingly seeing. And I've been to conferences which look more like the kind of music festival that young people enjoy so much, where everything is an experience. So not only speakers, but the food, the catering is an experience, the music. Yeah, conferences these days are much more Instagrammable, if you like, than before. Looking good, sounding good. What you want is when people come into the room, is they take out their phones and do a selfie and say, "Wow, this is amazing! I'm going to be here for 3 days." Uh, that is when you know that you've got the experience right, and we're going to have to get good at that. Mm. Mm.
Sorry, I lost my sound for a minute. I was just saying to people that I had accidentally muted myself. I was just saying to people about just chatting with Rob about the way that when you go to a scientific conference, things have changed now, and things should be changing because we're not just dumping information on people's heads. You're having to perform and be a little bit artistic, and my apologies for having muted myself on the stream and forgetting to unmute myself. These things happen. So let's get to something a bit more practical now, and that this is we have this meetings industry. I've got a couple of at least one question from the audience that I want to throw in a minute. But before we get to that, I have this question that has been burning in my mind for a while, and that is that the majority of interpreters, if not, the vast majority of them, count as smaller suppliers. And I think there's now a real awareness in parts of the meetings industry that smaller suppliers tend not to get a fair crack of the whip. So, if you go to a conference for the meetings industry, the speakers will tend to be CEOs of big companies, and most of the speakers probably haven't actually organised an event for a few years. They're talking about their view from the top down. And then when you talk to certain conferences, I'm not going to name them, but there are certain conferences in the UK certainly, that even if you have good content, their thing is, well, since you're a supplier, you need to pay for a stand if you want to speak. So what is it? Are there things that the meetings industry can be doing now proactively when in-person events are still quiet that can allow them to hear more from the expertise of smaller suppliers like interpreters who might have something really important to say?
It's really the key question, I would say, at the moment. I'm a kind of Johnny come lately person when it comes to conference interpreters. And like too many people in our industry, I was kind of aware that, that conference interpreters were necessary for some meetings. They were one of a string of different suppliers with the caterers, the florists, and this kind of thing. And it was 3 years ago, I think, I was contacted by AIC, one of the international associations for interpreters, and they kindly invited me to speak at one of their events in Cartagena, in Colombia. I enjoyed the experience very much, but I learned a lot about your industry at that event, and it's something that ever since then I've spoken at quite a number of conferences for interpreters. It's always a pleasure, and I always learn as much as I teach at those events. Now, we can't go on like this. The situation has to change. And one of my messages when I'm speaking at conferences for conference interpreters is that you need to have your voice heard at conference industry events. Now, um, conference conference industry events are very numerous. I think you've heard the expression oversharing when it comes to things like Facebook. Well, I sometimes think that people in the conference industry overconference. We love going to events and we love organizing conferences for conference organizers, for conference venues, for different people or for everyone in the conference industry. We have many associations. Some people would say too many, um, and each of those associations has an annual conference. It might be a national association of conference planners, or it could be an international organization like MPI, Meeting Professionals International. Um, we have many conferences. On top of that, we have many exhibitions and trade fairs annually for our industry. I see in my diary today, I have penciled in um, for IBTM in Barcelona at the end of the year. Now, the whole world is there. Um, I want to see more conference interpreters speaking at those events. educating conference venues, conference organizers, meeting planners about your role and about the importance of getting professional interpreters. Because with my own ears, I still hear conference organizers saying, oh, we'd better get an interpreter. Wait a minute, I know a woman, she spent a year living in France. She can do the interpreting. Well, no,
Classic case.
classic case. I spent 9 years living in France, and I fell into this trap not at a conference but a small meeting. And I can tell you, after 10 minutes, I had a headache trying to listen, think, and interpret all at once. I have no idea how you people do it. It's not human, but you do it incredibly well, and you need to tell the world, and a good platform for telling the world are these conferences and trade shows where you have the rest of the conference industry present. They need to hear your story. They need to also hear when things go wrong because the organizer has not hired a professional interpreter or has not given them the equipment that you need or has said, well, one interpreter will be enough. No, they need to hear from you about things going wrong. They need to hear about things going wrong at any level of meeting
Mm.
where the interpreting has been faulty because it's been done on the cheap or it has been done using the various forms of technology that are available, which, as everyone listening to this knows, lack the human instinct, the
Mm.
nuances which only human interpreters can provide. We need to hear that story. I'm aware of it, uh, but all my colleagues in the mice industry need to hear that from you.
I was going to say, so we've got a question from Hedwig which really speaks to what you're talking about, and she asks, why is it when you go to mice webinars, even on international events, that the word interpreting just isn't mentioned at all? Is there, what's the reason why the mice industry has just decided no?
It, partly what I'm saying that we've always kind of thought it's something peripheral. And conference organizers learn by their mistakes when they've got a faulty uh, interpretation system lined up and the meeting doesn't go well. We always think in terms of conferences and meetings meeting their objectives.
Mm.
And of course, communication is a key objective, otherwise, why come together? Uh, and good communication at international events usually depends on high level professional interpreting. And we just need to hear your story much more often. We
Mm.
need to understand that you are part of our industry, that you are the key to the difference successful and an unsuccessful conference. I speak at a lot of international conferences, and as I told you, very often the interpreters are there only for me. It's very nice, but I, over the years, very quickly learned the difference between a good interpreter and a poor interpreter. And I suspect that the poor interpreters are the ones who've spent a year in France and have been
Mm.
pulled in by the organizers. So we need to hear your story much more, and I will do everything I can to get more of a presence for you all at these events.
I mean, that's really comforting to hear. And you using the words "hear your story," that's language which we don't always hear. So I'm used to when interpreters do get the stage. I'm used to interpreters talking about the standards and the booth sizes and the things put in place that are there to make things work. But what I think is fascinating is you talked about we need to hear your story. Is there something more powerful about an interpreter standing up and talking about? I could easily talk about when I've interpreted at events and things have gone wrong, or why the consultant interpreter isn't just someone you phoned 2 weeks before. I can tell stories rather than saying here's a rule book, memorize it.
Hmm.
What's the right approach for interpreters? Is this storytelling the right approach, or are we better kind of talking in strictly monetary, strictly value-based terms.
Well, this sounds like a very weird thing to be saying to interpreters, but let's begin by learning our language. Now, I'm speaking there about the language that mice professionals use with each other. For example, meeting the objectives of the conference. That speaks volumes because conference organizers know that their job stands or falls by the extent to which the conference meets its objectives. And a good conference organizer will be able to give you a list of the objectives of that event because no one should ever say, it's been a long time since we had a conference. Let's have a conference. No, it doesn't work like that. There are always objectives. And so I would say my advice, and I know, Jonathan, you came along to a conference industry event in London. Drop in, come along and listen to the presentations which are being made already. Listen to the vocabulary that we're using, because that way, when you come to speak, you'll be using that terminology that we use with each other, and then you will be more convincing. We know that you are all language experts, and that's wonderful. I mean, anyone with a half of a brain can only be dumbstruck with admiration for interpreters because you assimilate knowledge very, very quickly on a whole range of topics. Well, you know all this, but we also need to see how you add value to the conference and how you are a guarantor of that conference being a successful one.
That idea of being the guarantor of the conference being a successful one, that sounds like something we should put on a nameplate somewhere.